So the idea is that hopefully you can reflect on this after the presentation or send it out to anybody you think might benefit from it. We do have a few seats available in the seats here. If anybody at the back wants to move up, please feel free to do so. So I'll just introduce our speakers. So first up, we're going to have Madison Sturba. So Madison is a program development coordinator for the Invasive Species Center, where she focuses her training and outreach, particularly on forest and agricultural pests. She graduated from the University of Windsor with a master's in science and biology and has an honors and a Bachelor of Science in behavior, cognition, and neuroscience. So welcome. And then we'll have Nicole Mielewczyk. Nicole is the plant health survey biologist for Ontario. So she develops and oversees surveys to detect or delimit populations of invasive species. So she enjoys the many opportunities to collaborate with a wide variety of people to research and promote plant health issues such as oak wilt, hemlock woolly adelgid, and spotted lanternfly. So let's give a warm welcome to our speakers. Just so everyone knows, for questions, we're just going to have a question period after each presentation and then an open discussion at the end. So if you could just reserve your questions for then, and then again, for those attending virtually, please just put your questions into the chat box and we will make sure they get passed along. Okay, great.
Thanks so much. Okay, hi everybody on the screen too. It's great to see so many of you coming to join us today to learn about oak wilt, and it's great to see so many people care about oak health and forest health in general, so that's awesome. Let me just figure this out. Perfect. Okay, so I'm from the Invasive Species Center. So just a really quick background in case you don't know who we are. We're a not-for-profit organization that mobilizes action against invasive species that harm the environment, economy, and society. To do this in a number of ways, we have really great partner groups that we work with. We do a lot of education and outreach. We do mobilize action on the ground ourselves as well. So we're based in Sault Ste. Marie, but we have staff all over Ontario. I'm coming from Windsor today. So let's hop right into it. What is oak wilt? Oak wilt is a vascular disease of oak trees caused by the non-native fungus Brachylia phagocerum. It has been found in North America for quite some time now, but no one really knows exactly where it came from or how it got here. But we do know that it spreads in the xylem of oak trees. So the xylem is the vessels in the vascular tissue that transports water and nutrients up from the roots towards the canopy. And so when this fungus is spreading, it blocks those vessels and really limits that transport of materials. And so without the water and the nutrients from the roots, those leaves can wilt and drop, and that's basically where the disease gets its name from. All oak trees can become infected with oak wilts, but red oaks are particularly vulnerable. They can die in a single season. Sometimes it's even as early as 2 to 6 weeks, really just depending on the initial time of infection, so pretty soon. Just in case you're not familiar with the different types of oak groups, we have red and white oaks in the major groups. There are a couple different ways to tell the difference. You can look at the shape of the trees, the texture of the bark, the acorns, but the most obvious for me at least is the leaves. So red oaks will have these really sharp pointed tips, and then white oaks will have rounded lobes. And I noticed when I was driving and there's lots of oak leaves on the ground and some on the tree still. So maybe when you leave here, just take a look-see and see if you can tell the difference between a red and white oak tree. So why do white oaks and red oaks respond differently to oak wilt? I know there looks like there's a lot going on in this slide, but it's really just to try and show you the differences in what's happening in those vessels. So for white oaks, they have a really fast immune response, and they'll find the fungus, they'll detect it, and they'll form these little protrusions in their vessels to really block that fungus. So if you see a white oak tree with symptoms of oak wilt, you'll typically see it isolated in little pockets on the tree, maybe 1 or 2 branches flagging with discoloration, but it won't affect the entire tree because it's really limited that spread. Red oaks try and do that, but they're not as successful. They're slower to form these kind of protrusions, so it really doesn't block the fungus at all. And instead, really, it's the combination of their immune response and the fungus spreading that causes their mortality in the end. So it really is just a difference in physiology there. So where is oak wilt? It has been found in 24 US states, several of which border Ontario. We can see all the different impacted counties in the states there in yellow, so it has become quite widespread over there. The closest known US detection to us was on Belle Isle, Michigan, which is just across the border from Windsor. It's within 500 meters or so. So we did think that Windsor would be the initial site of introduction into Canada, but it was actually in the city of Niagara Falls last year in May. And then since then, we've also found it in the township of Springwater and the town of Niagara on the Lake. So it kind of shows that invasive species sometimes do their own thing and they don't always pop up exactly where you would expect them to. So how do we identify oak wilt? What does it look like? The first sign that you'll see are canopy symptoms. So what you'll tend to see is leaf discoloration starting at the leaf edges here and then working its way inwards towards this middle line, the midrib. You'll also tend to see discoloration starting at the top of the tree first and then working its way downward as the disease progresses. Oak wilt does result in complete defoliation. So it kind of looks like what you would expect to see in the fall with like just the natural leaf drop, but it's happening much sooner out of season in June or July. So there are a lot of different oak wilt lookalikes out there, especially last year. I noticed it was quite a big year for it, just with the wetter and drier conditions that we had. So we have oak wilt here on the left, and we have an example of a lookalike here with anthracnose, and then 2 leaf scorch examples just to kind of show the variation of what you might see out there. They can look quite similar, but there are a couple ways you might be able to tell the difference. We can look at, the individual leaves themselves. So for anthracnose here, for example, this is also caused by a fungus, but the trees do recover from it. So here we can see that anthracnose causes these blotchy, kind of raised, bubbly like brown patches. The leaf kind of folds in, and that's not what we see with oak wilt. So we can look at individual leaf differences. We can also kind of look at the landscape level. So if you're noticing that all the oak trees throughout your neighborhood or your property are starting to show these types of symptoms, it's likely not oak wilt. Oak wilt is a slow-moving disease, so it's more likely to show up in smaller patches first. It's not like emerald ash borer where it just spread super rapidly and all the ash trees were pretty much done for. There is some hope with oak wilt. It is slower moving. So that's something just to keep in mind. We can also look at leaf retention. So if you're seeing these types of oak wilt-like symptoms pop up in the landscape, but the leaves are remaining on the trees, they're not falling off, especially all throughout the growing season, that could be a sign that it's more of a lookalike, because like I said, oak wilt does cause complete defoliation. So it is important just to start regularly monitoring the health of oak trees now. New leaves will start popping up soon, so pay attention to, if they do pop out, and if they start falling off early, things like that. And this is what a stand could look like. All these trees have been dead from oak wilt. You can see here that clearly they shouldn't look like this. There is a lot of greenery, healthy trees surrounding it. So it really can wipe out the oak trees if we're not. It is slow moving, but it doesn't mean that it can't spread and still cause a lot of damage. Okay, so we looked at leaf symptoms. What else can we look at to find oak wilt? We can look at the branches and the trunk. So oak wilt causes these large vertical bark cracks. Hopefully you can see it there. They are caused by underlying pressure pads, which I'll get into in my next slide. But I just want to show here that it can kind of be difficult to spot sometimes because normal oak bark does have these kind of grooves that resemble those types of cracks. So sometimes it can take more of a trained eye to find these cracks. You'll see in an upcoming video that if you can't see the cracks, you can hear them. So if you take like a tool and you're tapping on the tree, it'll sound hollow right behind this crack. So that's something to keep in mind too. So these are pressure pads and fungal mats. This is what caused that crack in the previous picture. So these will form after a tree dies. So a red oak will become infected with oak wilt, it'll die, and then over time it'll accumulate the fungus underneath the bark and it'll create, this is the fungal mat here, this like brown, this darker section. And then this is the pressure pad on top of it. So the pressure pad is where the spores are being produced. It's where they're being created. And over time, they'll grow and grow and grow, and it'll push up against the bark and create that crack with all that pressure. It can look different depending on the year. So little like fresher pressure pads will look lighter in color. They'll have this gray or white color. And then over time, as they age, they'll turn darker and eventually they'll turn totally black. I haven't personally smelt it, but people in the field that have interacted with oak wilt have said it has a really strong juicy fruit smell, like juicy fruit gum. It kind of smells like wine, fermenting fruit kind of thing. So if you're walking through your neighborhood and you suddenly start to smell gum and you don't have any on you, maybe take a look at the nearby trees and see what's going on. Okay, so this is a video here. It's this guy, Philip, he works with Michigan DNR. This is a clip taken from our YouTube channel. but he's going through and trying to find oak wilt. So here he's going to find a vertical bark crack. He's going to hear it and he's going to cut it down so you can see the underlying pressure pad. I'll preface this by saying, if you do see a vertical bark crack, don't just start whacking it yourself with an axe. We'll have to contact the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They'll come out and be the ones to inspect it and all that stuff. But this is for fun educational purpose, so you can see what it looks like when someone's actually looking for oak wilts.
Another one right there, like I said. Oh, and look at this one right here.
Hopefully you can hear that.
Very close. Because the bark is so craggy, sometimes they're hard to see, but you can always hear them. Even if that hasn't popped yet, you'll always hear that. You'll always hear that. So I'm gonna open these up, take a look. Let's see if we can find some nitadulids on some of these.
So you can see two fungal mats there, and they're older, they're pretty dark.
Ooh, there's a little bit of that smell.
You smell a little bit of juicy fruit gum there too.
Another one right there.
There we go. Okay, so oak wilt spreads in a couple different ways. It can actually spread above ground and underground. So above ground, it can spread with the help of nitidulid beetles or human activity. And underground, it can spread through root grafts. So I will go through each of these now. So we'll start off with how it spreads with the nitidulid beetles. So nitidulid beetles are also called sap beetles. They're native, they're hanging around all the time. They're attracted to sweet smells like the fruity wine-like odor of those pressure pads. They're attracted to the smell of fresh sap at a new tree wound. So the idea is that, a tree that's dead from oak wilt, it'll have those pressure pads. Those pressure pads will create a crack in the bark, and that smell will come through the bark and attract these beetles. So they'll come in, they'll feed on those spores. And while they're feeding, like you can see here in this picture, they do get covered in those spores, their little bodies. And then they'll leave that site in search of new food. And if there happens to be an oak tree nearby that was recently wounded and they smell that sap, they can go to that tree and pass on those spores. So that's how they would transfer the fungus from an infected tree to a healthy tree. And these are pretty small beetles. They're probably like 6 millimeters on average. So they're quite small. They can be hard to see, but they can definitely wiggle their way into the bark crack. This is just kind of to show that they don't really move that far. They tend to they're not strong flyers, so they tend to stay within maybe 2 kilometers. So that's one of the reasons why oak wilt is kind of a slower moving disease, because these guys aren't really moving all that far. They're also the reason why we have pruning windows. So we recommend not to prune oak trees during the growing season between April and October. It's really because that's when sap beetles are most active. So if you do prune an oak tree during this time, which you shouldn't, but if you do, or you come across a tree that's been wounded from, like a storm, for example, we've had a lot of storms recently, or maybe you are weed whacking a tree and you get a little bit too close and you nick the bark. If any of that happens and you notice a wound, we recommend painting it over. So painting it with pruning paint or clear shellac just to seal those wounds and prevent any of that smell from releasing and attracting any of those beetles. There's a lot of ongoing research right now for Canada specifically on the risk periods here and when those beetles are most active, when they start emerging, things like that. So we're going off of a lot of the United States research right now. So for example, in Michigan, they have this oak wilt risk meter, and they kind of break it down into the greatest risk, lowest risk, and safest period windows. But we're just kind of out of an abundance of caution, joining those greatest and lowest risk periods together, and just recommending not to prune oak trees from April to October. If there is like a really unseasonably warm day, especially during this time of year, I would also hold off on pruning, just in case like the little beetles get confused and start coming out. But in general, April to October is what we're going with. Oops, sped ahead there. There we go. So oak wilt can also spread above ground through human activity, primarily through the movement of firewood, and this kind of goes with invasive species in general. It's a very common theme. So like I said, the pressure pads can form after the oak tree is dead, and so those can be hiding under the bark. You never really know what you have. So our motto is just to burn where you buy. If you're coming to the park, for example, to stay, buy the wood here. Don't be moving it from your house. That's like 2 hours away. You really could be introducing something to the area and harming the environment here. So oak wilt does spread underground as well through root grafting. So trees of the same species can form root grafts in the soil. So it'd be like 2 red oaks, 2 white oaks, for example, if they're growing nearby. And usually this is pretty good for the trees. It can help them share water and nutrients, things like that. But it can also mean that they spread diseases that way as well. So unfortunately, oak wilt can kind of take advantage of the system and move from an infected tree over to a healthy tree this way underground. And oak wilt does remain transmittable through grafts for several years after the oak tree has died or is removed. So it is a major vector. This is what it looks like from above. Oak wilt does spread kind of radiating outward. So we can see these skeletons, these older dead trees here. They have died. And then you can see the leading edge of the disease with these newer trees that are yellowing. They're newly infected. Clearly, again, it's a time of year when this shouldn't be happening. There's a nice green forest around it. If this site does go undetected or unmanaged, it could continue to spread outward and kill all of those oak trees there. So there are a couple different ways to manage oak wilts. In Canada, we have tree removals and trenching. So trenching would be done with this bigger machine. It's called a vibratory plow. It's about 4 to 5 feet long, that blade there, and it just goes in the ground and it literally just cuts up the roots and severs those connections. So, I mean, it's kind of loud, but that's what the machine's doing there. It's just severing those root connections. This is what it looks like a year later. I took these pictures from a site in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They had removed a bunch of different oak trees and then they did trenching. So you can see that the land does recover. Like, it looks like a kind of intense method when you're cutting the ground like that, but things do grow over. So this is one old trench line right here, and they placed it along the trail just to limit the amount of disturbance they're doing in the forest there. So that's 1 year later. And then here, the old trench line actually runs right here. So we can see the grass coming back in and it's starting to look good again. Definitely better than it would have looked if all those oak trees had died and needed to be removed. There are a couple other management options that are used in the States. So in addition to tree removals and trenching, they also use chemical treatments and girdling. So girdling, for example, is what it looks like. They'll cut a ring around the tree. They'll also inject chemicals for that as well. But this is primarily used in times when you can't drag those big equipments into the area. So they'd use this a lot on slopes, for example. So I just wanted to touch on the city of Niagara Falls, kind of do a little case study on what exactly happened there for the first detection. Like I said, it was confirmed here in Niagara Falls for the first time in May. What happened was a homeowner contacted a local arborist asking for a quote to remove 3 dead oak trees off of their property. The arborist came, you can see, this is what they saw, a big dead tree. Everything else around it is looking good. So the arborist inspected it more closely to kind of see what was going on, noticed the signs of oak wilt, and contacted the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is great, that's what you should do, and then also contacted the city of Niagara Falls as well. And this really triggered a really large collaborative rapid response. So this is what the arborist saw. You can see this nice long vertical bark crack. I think there's even another one over here. So that's quite the obvious crack. And then this is the underlying pressure pads when CFIA and the city opened it up, that's what they could see. So you can see these 3 really new, nice looking pressure pads, and that's what created this vertical crack. Looking at this, you can pretty much say it is oak wilt. It's pretty distinctive for oak wilt, but you still do need a genetic testing. So CFIA would have to come, collect a sample, send it to the lab and do testing just to make sure, because you never know, but it is pretty distinctive for oak wilt. So there were a lot of simultaneous steps that happened in response to this detection. One of them was extensive surveying. So I know CFIA, which we'll hear about soon, did a lot of surveying, and the city also did a lot of surveying. So this is a picture taken from the city of Niagara Falls database. They have a really great tree inventory. And so all of those dots are the different oak trees throughout the city. So they knew exactly where to go survey, which trees to check. They would also record like what condition the trees were in. That way, if they went to go revisit later, if something happened, they could see like, you know, the health of the tree, the progress of what happened. And they really did note that this was a really key element to their response. It really did help streamline everything, made everything like, yeah, just a more rapid response that way. So if you do have a large property or a woodlot, even just in your neighborhood, just pay attention to where the trees are, the red oaks, try and pay attention to their condition. If they're declining fast, that could be a sign that something's wrong, things like that. This is what the tree removals looked like. Required some pretty heavy equipment there. They dragged the trees over the house with the big crane. And then when you take the trees out, you can't let them sit there for very long, just because, again, it is a new wound, so you don't want to attract those beetles. So they chopped up the tree pretty quickly and loaded it into these big trucks. They tarped the trucks over so that nothing could spill out. You couldn't attract any beetles in there. And there are a couple of different disposal methods that are approved by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. For the state of Niagara Falls, what worked best was deep burial. So what they did was they brought these trucks loaded with all their Oak Wilt infected wood. They dug a huge hole, dumped it all in, and then covered it up. Oak wilt can't transfer through the soil. So this is like a safe method. It's no longer going to be spreading oak wilt this way. Since it was such a big project, they couldn't do it all in one day. So they had to leave the stumps overnight. So they painted it and covered it up really tightly so that nothing could get in, couldn't spread anything that way. And then the next day came back and removed them and put dirt and seed over it to cover it all up. So all in all, I think it took about 2 days, which is incredible to remove 3 trees, the amount of precautionary measures that went into it. It was a huge job. I can only imagine. I wasn't there, but so status update. Where is Oak Wilt now? What are we looking at? So all 3 detections in all 3 locations were made relatively close together. They were made within 1 to 2 months of each other. But the 3 dead oak trees in the city of Niagara Falls were spore producing trees, so they needed to be removed immediately. So like I said, they were found in May, they were removed in June. Since then, there have been 6 infected trees. They did start the removal process for that, I believe, last week. So they're definitely on track to meet those goals of removal by end of March. Township of Springwater, there was 1 infected tree that was removed last year in November. And then Niagara-on-the-Lake, there were 9 infected trees that were removed in December. So right now, all of the infected trees that were confirmed positive for oak wilt have either been removed or are currently being removed. So things are looking up for oak wilt. There has been a lot of ongoing monitoring and no additional detections have been found. So there is a positive silver lining here. It is a slow moving disease and we are still in the eradication phase of things. So I'll kind of wrap up my talk here with just talking about resources, just in case you're not familiar with the ISC. We do have a lot of free resources that you can download online, specifically for oak wilt as well. We have a species profile here. It's like an Oak Wilt 101. It also has direct links to go report to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So if you do find oak wilt, that's where you would go. You'd go to them. We also have fact sheets. I have a bunch up here, so please take them. Feel free to help yourself. And we have lots of other resources as well. We do have a monthly webinar series where we bring in experts each month to talk about different invasive species issues. And I bring that up because we had a really great oak wilt expert panel Q&A session where we had experts talk about the first detection. So you could check that out if you have any questions about that. We have an invasive species training program that has an oak wilt training course in it. So it's a whole deep dive into oak wilt, how to manage it, all that jazz. And that's available on our website. So you can check that out for more oak wilt type resources as well. And then we had our 2024 invasive species forum, I believe 2 weeks ago now. But it's an annual event that we hold to bring attention to invasive species issues, research, and advances in prevention and management. I bring this one up because we had an oak wilt special session. We had 7 expert speakers come and talk about their current research and responses to oak wilt. So really cool things like rapid assay tests, tracking oak wilt from the sky, from space. So really cool talks if you're interested. All the recordings are available on our YouTube channel. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. I can take questions now. This is my email address too, so feel free to reach out anytime. Always open to questions about oak wilt or any other kind of forest pests that you know. Yes, in the. It's near Barrie.
I'm just gonna interrupt.
Yeah.
Could you maybe, just so that folks virtually can hear the questions?
Yeah.
When the questions gets asked. Do you mind
Oh,
repeating it?
perfect. Yeah. So she asked if the 3rd detection in Springwater is near the Niagara region. And no, it's near Barrie. Yeah, so it did kind of jump over. Behind, yes.
Why is it that the wind can't carry the spores?
So why can't the wind carry
And
the
then I have another
spores?
question, and it's about the girdling treatment.
Yeah,
I think when they girdle it, that means they go all the way around, right?
for girdling, they do go all around the tree, yes. They do rings around the tree and then they'll inject fungicides in there to treat the tree, and then it'll come down and they'll drag it out of the stand.
Okay.
Yeah. For the wind question, if wind can carry the fungal spores, I'm not too sure about that. I really don't think so. I mean, the spores are underneath the bark. So the reason that the nidodulid beetles are such a good vector is because they can get underneath the bark and like feed on it. And like the spores would need to go over to another tree and get directly into the wound site. Yeah, you can add to that.
So imagine that the fungal mat is like a thick mushroom room on a tree, but beneath the bark. So as the tree has died and the fungal mat continues to exert that outward pressure, it doesn't become completely exposed typically. Usually there's just a bit of an open crack where the insects can get in. And as Maddie mentioned, just spreading the disease by wind typically is incredibly minusculely low risk for it getting into an open tree wound and therefore actually furthering the progress of the disease. So perhaps under the exact right conditions, a bit of the actual fungal mat might fly off, but the odds of it actually flying off and landing in a freshly wounded oak tree are just not realistic.
Yes.
Say you're down in Niagara Falls and a homeowner finds the well and phones the right people and they diagnose it.
Mhm.
Who manages, just gonna phone up Joe Blow, tree cutting guy, who manages it so it's done right?
Yeah, so the question is, who manages the Oak Wilt, especially if you're in the Niagara region, when you call, what happens next? So Nicole will talk about the response more in her presentation, so some of your question might get answered there. But it was a really large collaborative response. The city of Niagara Falls did a lot of the work. CFIA was there to sanitize everything and overlook the whole process. But the city were the ones that actually came down, took down the trees, that kind of thing.
Sounds like a crime scene or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So did the city pay for the tree removal or did the homeowner have to cover it?
So the question is, who paid? Did the city pay for it? And the city did incur a lot of the costs. I know there's a lot of different funding programs that they had accessible to them. I know the CFIA helped out. It's hard to say what the situation will be moving forward. This is just the first case of it, so it's hard to say who's going to be paying in the future if Oak Wilt does spread. But for this case, the city did pay for those. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but.
I'll add a little bit more in my presentation, but because of this first scenario and all the data that the CFI had, when we were confident about those 3 detections, CFIA is reimbursing the costs for the tree removal. As Madison mentioned, there were costs that the city of Niagara Falls incurred, and they did apply for a couple of grant opportunities, but CFIA had declared that we would be taking an active management approach and therefore was contributing to the active management approach.
Awesome, thanks. Yes.
I got one more.
Sure.
So, we had a gypsy moth thing here a while back, and we did a spraying type of thing. And then they kind of move on, because we saw a map of it, came in through New Jersey, through the west, and they left the area, I think. I don't think they're as much worried as they were a couple of years ago. Does this stuff leave, or does this stuff stay there forever? Stick with it, finish itself off, and that'd be the end of it. Like what's been happening down in the States, where you see those big map things that we had displayed there.
Yeah, so you can start, sure, yeah.
So it will stay until it kills all the oak trees unless we're actively managing it. The research does not indicate it infects any other species of trees. Now you compare it to the spongy moth, which has not necessarily moved on to other areas. Spongy moth is going through its normal peaks and valleys, and human beings help it reach its valley through treatments, but spongy moth also has some biocontrols in the area. It has a disease that will infect populations and help reach that dip. So it's very likely spongy moth will boom again in the next 5 to 7 years, whereas the oak wilt disease will continue to spread to oak trees as long as there is no active management.
So I'm just gonna interrupt, Nicole, they can't hear you, yeah, so if you're just answering questions. Do you
Come on
want
up.
to-
Come join me. You're
I'll
coming
get
up
there
anyway
later
soon, so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do these beetles have any natural predators, birds that eat them?
Yeah, so the beetles are native, so they don't cause any problems. They're just the vector for the disease.
What eats them, I guess is my question.
I don't know what eats them.
Yep, birds would
Birds,
probably eat them, other mammals, because they're
native here, it's very likely that there are a plethora of different species that feed on it, and that's what keep these other insects at a normal level as opposed to a boom like spongy moth, for example. But not enough to completely prevent the spread of oak wilt.
At the very back there.
The map that you showed us of Niagara, is that just Niagara City properties?
In Niagara Falls, it was,
It
oh, that was just an example. Yeah. So that map there would be the city trees. Yeah. Yes.
The girdling process, the tree is already dead at that point?
So for girdling, the tree is infected. It's not already dead. That's just one of the ways that you treat it. So they'll girdle a tree and then inject insecticides to treat it and then remove it.
Then remove it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not savable at that point.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Why are there different treatments in Canada and the US?
Yeah, so yeah, I was just gonna do that. So the question was, why are there more treatment options in the States? They've been dealing with it for much longer than we have. So they've had more research, they've had more time to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. That's good.
Yeah.
I was wondering though, if it's a native beetle, so why is it suddenly happening? Climate change? Like why is this spreading all of a sudden?
You could take this, yeah. Of how it was introduced.
So while the beetles are native, them spreading the disease is just a byproduct. So sorry, the question for those online is, if the beetles are native, why is the disease now spreading? The disease has been documented in the United States for quite some time, at least since the 1940s. And I'll talk about it a little bit in my presentation, but the United States have been managing the disease rather passively because it's so widespread, as you saw on the map that Madison had up earlier. Whereas in Canada, we have been preparing for the introduction since it was detected on Belle Isle in Michigan back in 2016. So as with COVID, for example, the disease cropped up and humans were a vector for spread. We're not doing it on purpose. A lot of times we do try to prevent it, but it does not stop the fact that it's just an additional vector for this disease to spread.
That's a good answer.
Thank you. I do get that question a lot as well. So.
There's any other questions? If not, we can always answer them at the end too. So yeah.
So I will, there's just two here. I'm just gonna come up.
Yeah. Join us.
We'll shift
So
over.
someone did ask if the pinery is planning to treat the trees with outbreaks. I'm not going to speak to that today just because we don't have anybody from the Pinery Park staff here, as Alistair's not here, but I can follow up and maybe in an email send out a response to that question. Someone asked if there is a safe and effective chemical treatment that can be applied.
Nothing is currently approved like that in Canada right now. I know in the States they do it and it is quite effective there. But I know they're working on it here, I think, right?
So
emergency responses.
I will note, while the United States does have chemicals, fungicides, to treat for oak wilt, there is no cure for
Yes,
oak
that's
wilt.
important, yeah.
Propiconazole is the treatment that they use in the United States. It has been discussed in Canada, but it's not currently approved for emergency use. Propiconazole, or this fungicide, would only be used to prolong the life of an infected oak wilt tree. For example, if it was a high value, important heritage tree, it can slow the chance of the tree becoming infected, but there are no cures for oak wilt at this time. And the United States has actually been researching it quite a bit. Like I said, they've had it since the 40s. So I can't speak to whether there'll ever be a cure for oak wilt. I'll get a little bit into what the CFIA has in our toolbox into my presentation.
And then just the last question is, someone's just wondering if you could just show the identification again, just so people get a better sense of
yeah,
when
like
they see that leaf.
Oh, the leaf. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you.
I can make my way back.
It was a great presentation, by the way. That all your images were
Oh, thank
wonderful.
Thank you. I was obsessed with making my slides. the other
Yes,
night.
you did an amazing
You
job.
did great answering questions. All right. Yeah.
You said that the leaves start dying at the top of the tree first.
Yeah, so that's typically where you'll see the symptoms appear first is the top of the tree, and then it'll kind of work its way down.
So that seems counterintuitive to me, this is spreading up the vascular system of the tree and being blocked along the way.
Yeah, that's a good, I don't, it's just like, yeah,
So-
do you want to say?
You can think of it as the tree will have enough energy to get it to get water and nutrients to the lower branches, but getting the proper water and nutrients that the disease needs to the top branches will become harder and harder. And so it'll start wilting from the top. Now that's for red oaks. White oaks, Maddie had the great image of the it blocking the disease movement. And so while white oaks may be able to do that and prevent the disease from spreading and reducing the amount of water and nutrients that can get to certain portions of the tree, it won't be able to do that for the entire tree. So that's why white oaks tend to live a little bit longer. They can prolong the life in half of the tree or a few key branches, but some may die. Overall, focus less on where you see the bronzing and defoliation and focus more on those leaf symptoms and comparing it to the lookalikes. What I tell people is if your oak tree is losing leaves in June and July, take a second look, try to figure out why. If it reflushes, it's probably not oak wilt. It's very likely it's either environmental factors or another disease, perhaps insect pressure. But if it loses its leaves and they don't come back and you notice concerning discoloration coming from the leaf margins and working its way in, call me.
Yes.
Burr oaks,
They can be infected as well.
and it's the same progression.
The question was what about bur oaks? And they can be infected as well, and it'll be the same progression.
Okay.
And the black and the chickpeas and all that, mhm.
Every single species of oak, yes.
Yes, at the back.
So if I have an infected oak, say I have 10 oaks in the perimeter of my property and I have one that I identify, do they all have to come down or just that one?
No, they wouldn't all have to come down. It depends on like how close together they are. So for underground roots grafting, there's a whole equation, there's a whole math behind. You can look up at a chart. Depends on how big the trees are, how far away they are from each other. That'll determine the likelihood of the underground spread. But it wouldn't automatically mean that you have to remove all the trees on your property if there's only one infected.
I'll get into that in my presentation as well, so I'm not going to add anything here.
Okay, well, maybe
So
I'll.
one more question, but it might be a good one to answer at the end. Someone was just wondering about the extent of the impact in the US on the forests. So has it had a devastating effect such as the Dutch elm disease?
Do you want to you've seen some of it. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it has had quite an impact in the States. It does spread quite a bit. And yeah, like you mentioned, they have been managing it for quite some time now. So it has had quite a big impact.
And the United States is at a point where they cannot eradicate oak wilt.
Yeah.
They can try to slow the spread. When you slow the spread of a disease or insect that affects plant health, the only way that you can really slow is putting controls on humans, asking them not to move firewood, having those pruning bans, that kind of thing. I have stood on the Canadian side and looked at Belle Isle in Michigan, and I've done it in one of the most beautiful days in July, and it looks like a tree graveyard.
Yeah.
Now that's an area where it's very difficult, of course, to remove the trees, but that can kind of put into perspective what could happen if a disease like this or any plant pest really goes unmanaged. I mean, we all remember what happened with emerald ash borer as well. So sorry for the doom and gloom there.
Okay.
Well,
Great.
Thank you. You did a great job too.
should just be. So. Okay. Just make sure that's good for you. Can we just do that? Aha. There we go. And I'm just stealing this.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that plugged in indicator? No, it is.
It is, yeah.
What do I need? Sorry. That's fine. Okay. Thanks.
No worries. Okay. So, as Erin mentioned earlier, my name is Nicole Mielewczyk, and I am the Ontario Plant Health Survey Biologist for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. With my role, there's a handful of activities that I oversee, but essentially, if you want to remember anything, think of all the invasive plant pests that we have. Remember back to emerald ash borer, consider spongy moth, spotted lanternfly, and now oak wilt. My job is to help design and oversee the implementation of surveys to detect these plant pests or delimit them and support activities like the active management and eradication of oak wilt. So I am fortunate enough to be able to actually speed through quite a few of my first slides because Madison gave such a great overview of the background of the disease and the distribution in the United States. And a few key points that Madison spoke about that I will reiterate throughout my presentation are how the disease spreads and what you can do to slow it, stop it, and report it. I'm also going to speak more from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency perspective. One of the questions led to the answer that we've been preparing for it for quite some time. So what does CFIA preparing for something look like? Oak wilt, don't get me wrong, it's not great. But for an introduced invasive pest, CFIA was very prepared for it, and it's a slow-moving disease. And we were fortunate enough to have the time to develop a response framework that we followed quite closely. And we feel confident that we took the right approach. So I'll review the response framework as well, which I think will answer your question earlier of I'm a homeowner, what happens if I report it? And I will note this is a very heavy presentation, and I recognize you won't remember everything that I talk about today. So I'm going to finish with a few key take-home messages that we've really been sharing with members of the public to help, like I said, slow it, stop it, and report it if you see it. So like Madison mentioned, oak wilt is a vascular disease caused by the fungus Brucella phagocyrum. It can infect all species of oak trees, though red oaks tend to die faster because they can't develop that block within their xylem. The fungus develops on the outer sapwood, and it blocks the movement of nutrients and water to the upper leaves. It will cause defoliation and tree death, sometimes within a single season. The signs include bronzing and defoliation. And then once a tree has completely died, those fungal mats will begin to form, exerting an outward pressure on the bark, which will lead to bark cracks. So I was fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on your point of view, to be able to go see the detections that we've had in Ontario. And these two images are from the Niagara Falls detection. The leaf image I took myself, and you can see quite clearly that the bronzing did start at the margins and work its way in. And if you think back to Madison's presentation, that leaf symptom is quite different than what we saw with the leaf scorch image and the anthracnose image. What's key for me to remember when I'm looking at suspects is that oak wilt leaves that are infected, they typically won't curl or become disfigured like you might see in anthracnose or bacterial leaf scorch. Now, the image of the tree, I took that myself as well when we immediately went to the site. So that is also what the arborist saw when they reported it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the city of Niagara Falls. And I can confirm what Madison was saying. It does smell like juicy fruit, although I would truly compare it more to like a fermented fruit wine. It's very sweet, it's very distinct, and no, your oak trees should not smell like that. So like Madison mentioned, it has an above ground means of spreading and a below ground means of spreading, and humans can mediate the above ground means. Like I said, it's sort of fortunate that this was an invasive plant pest that we detected because it's so slow moving and we have so many tools to manage it. And I will say that is thanks to what's been happening in the United States. So again, we have here the map that shows where oak wilt has been detected in the United States. And you can see how close it is to the Canadian border at many different points. It was detected on Belle Isle in Michigan in 2016. And that led to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and a few partners working together to develop the Oak Wilt Response Framework for Canada, which the bulk of my presentation will focus on, so I won't talk about that yet. What's interesting to note, Madison said that Belle Isle, Michigan was within 500 meters of the Canadian border. The detection in Niagara Falls, and I know this because I did the math, was over 150 kilometers away from the nearest infestation, which is in Ontario County in New York. So I did zoom in a little bit here. And for those who might be able to see a little better on the virtual presentation, let me just go back a slide. We have Niagara Falls down here, and the nearest United States infestation is all the way over here. So that's quite a distance for it to have spread. And don't get me wrong, there's also quite a distance for it to have spread from Niagara Falls all the way up to Springwater. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So as with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency preparing by developing response framework, we also wanted to ensure that it was not already in Canada. So that's where my job comes in. Granted, I was not in the position at the time. My colleagues and my predecessor developed a survey to detect oak wilts early on so that we would be able to actively manage it. And since that time, we have continued these surveys every year. So the Oak Wilt Annual Survey in Ontario focuses on 60 sites that target forests with oak presence adjacent to some of our high-risk locations for introducing oak wilt. Those include infestations in the United States. So we put a lot of our resources in southwestern Ontario. Don't get me wrong, we do always have some in the Niagara Falls area in Toronto over Kingston, Ottawa. But considering how close Belle Isle was, we do a lot of surveys for oak wilt over there. We also collaborate with municipalities and collaborate with the Invasive Species Center to share information to local arborists and the municipalities' conservation authorities on how to detect oak wilt early. So my next slide will show a map of Canadian Food Inspection Agency sites, but that really doesn't scratch the surface for the number of eyes on the ground. We will also survey around mills importing oak products and locations that have firewood disposal bins. So those can be border crossings, disposal sites or dumps, and campgrounds. We typically begin this survey in July because, like I said, you should not be seeing bronzing or defoliation in your oaks at that time. And we do limit our sample collection to the low risk period. So if we see any suspect signs in July, we will not wound the oak trees unless the tree is completely dead and we are concerned that there is a fungal mat that is actively spreading the disease. In that case, and I'll get into it a little bit later when we talk about the Niagara Falls detection, we will open up the bark crack and take a sample of the wound and then paint it and cover it in saran wrap to prevent anything from getting in or out of it. Because above all, CFIA does not want to contribute to the spread of any invasive plant pests, and we have quite strict biosecurity measures or tools and sanitation processes that we put in place to prevent this. So at each site, we survey at least 50 oak over a 500-meter distance and aim to get a representation of the stand. So for the Pinery Provincial Park, for example, we would not just simply survey a single pocket of the oak trees. We would walk throughout as much of the park as possible aiming to thoroughly survey at least 50 trees, but our inspectors are always keeping their eyes on the canopies as well as scanning the ground for any leaves that might be able to show the signs and symptoms. So these are the results from our 2023 season. You can see we do have the red dots for the positive locations. All of these came through reports from the public. And then we had our other 60 sites throughout the province. Our first came from a report from an arborist who, like Madison said, was contracted in a residential neighborhood to provide a quote on the removal of 3 dead standing oak trees. The arborist, they'd actually done invasive species center training in the past, and so they knew the warning signs when they saw them and did not touch the tree. Immediately called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and provided images and notified the City of Niagara Falls of this risk. CFIA received the report at the end of May, and we went and sampled immediately, putting those biosecurity measures in place, like I said, wrapping the tree to prevent any additional insects from either entering or leaving. And within 2 weeks of receiving the positive results, we removed all 3 of the dead standing trees, just like Madison had talked about. So those images, they were the ones that I had taken at the site that day. So we did do additional surveys. I'll get into some of that work that we did in future slides, but through those additional surveys, we identified 6 more trees that would require removal because they were already showing the foliar symptoms of oak wilts, and then some that were within root grafting distance of the positive trees. And so we're very likely to be showing signs in the near future. Then at the beginning of June, we received another, we call it a report from the public, but it was actually a Canadian Food Inspection Agency staff member at their home that was in another residential area, this time up in Springwater. So you can see quite clearly the distance between the first detection and the second detection. This was a single oak tree that was exhibiting the foliar symptoms of oak wilt. So it wasn't an active risk for spreading the disease in real time. For that reason, we did not complete tree removal at that location until late November, like Madison had said. And then mid-June, we received another report from the public at the Niagara-on-the-Lake campus for Niagara College. This was, again, a single standing oak tree exhibiting the foliar symptoms of oak wilt. CFIA sampled, we worked with the college, and we determined that that tree, as well as 8 other trees that were in, one of those blocks where there are benches, they all would have to be removed for having oak wilt. So around each infected premise, CFIA mobilized very quickly, and we collaborated with Invasive Species Center to provide as much information to members of the public as possible. We collaborated with each of the municipalities, some conservation authorities in the area as well, and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to quickly implement any additional research that we wanted to, as well as complete very intensive surveys in the area. We surveyed every single oak tree within 400 meters of a positive detection. That is a number of trees I don't remember off the top of my head, but for context, that's over 500 properties around each of the detections. We also, thanks to the Invasive Species Center, really ramped up outreach with the public, and this led to over 450 reports of suspect oak wilt. While it is a lot of reports, we still only had those 3 detections in Ontario this year. And those reports were spread all throughout Southern Ontario, as well as some in Quebec as well. So now that you have a little background that's a little more in depth than what we talked about earlier, we'll get into the Oak Wilt Response Framework. As I mentioned, this was developed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and several partners, including the MNRF, Natural Resources Canada, their Canadian Forest Services Division, Invasive Species Center supported it, as well as some municipal partners that were at highest risk of introducing oak wilt, and our partners in the United States who had been managing it for a long time. This outlines comprehensive measures to be implemented in the event of an oak wilt detection. And if you are interested, it's publicly available. I've included the link down there, but I do not expect anyone to remember all those characters. If you Google Oak Wilt Response Framework for Canada, it'll be the first link that pops up. As well, I'm going to get into some outreach information and where you can find it. If you go to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency landing page for oak wilt, there's a link there, and I believe the Invasive Species Center has a link for it as well. I'm biased because I read it about 100 times this past summer, but it's actually quite an easy read. It's been written for members of the public to understand, not for us researchers to, rattle off the top of our head and impress people. So I would recommend it. It's broken down into a few sections, and of these sections, I'll be focusing on the highlighted ones for my presentation. I say as I'm halfway through the presentation. So outreach and education. This is something that we have been working on for a very, very long time. It's key to early detection. As you saw from the map, CFIA cannot be everywhere. Our partners cannot be everywhere. So sharing this information with members of the public like yourself, who are out and about going on walks, enjoying provincial parks, perhaps arborists, will really enhance the chance of early detection of this pest. And then early detection leads to the ability for rapid response and increases the chances of a successful eradication program. Some of the things that we educate on are the high, low, and lowest risk periods for the transmission of oak wilt and what activities can take place during those times. So Madison had included the great snippet of what Michigan shows as, I believe they call it the high, low, and safe periods for pruning. She's very right. We have been combining some of those periods. So we are explaining to members of the public that if possible, please limit pruning activities to November 1st to March 31st, because during that time, the beetle vectors that spread the disease are almost never active. Something that I've learned this past summer is we never say that there is a no risk period, because biology is beautiful and crazy and things happen sometimes. So we just say the safest period to reduce the risk of spread is from November 1st to March 31st. Some of the other information that we share, of course, is how to report this and where to find reliable resources if you want additional information or the most up-to-date information on where the disease is. And that leads into my next slide. Here, I guess I'm a little biased. I only have Canadian Food Inspection Agency information and Invasive Species Center information, but that's not to say that there isn't reliable information elsewhere. We just work really closely together to ensure that our messages are very aligned and that whenever you select a report a sighting link, it goes to the same place. So like I said, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency landing page has a lot of great information. Again, if you're not sure how to find it, Google Oak Wilt CFIA. It's the first link that pops up. Great information, great images. But the Invasive Species Center webpage has links to YouTube videos. It has information from other states and provinces on what they've been doing, and it houses a lot of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency information as well. I do also at this point want to call out some of the resources that I brought. And for the benefit of our online friends, I'll show you here too. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has these plant pest cards. I only brought our oak wilt ones, but they show great images of what the signs and symptoms are of oak wilt. So I've got a pile up there. Feel free to take some. Like I said, I'm biased, but I do keep some in my personal wallet in case I start talking about my passion while out and about. They have great images, and they also have the web address to go to if you suspect you found it. Then our comms branch recently put together postcards, as we like to call it, which have larger images of suspect oak wilt. It has information on what you can do and how you can prevent the spread on the back, as well as a QR code that you can scan if you want additional information. Like I said, it's up at the front here, and I will be leaving some for the Pinery for those who are virtual now and plan to swing by the Pinery at another point. So moving on, I'm going to briefly talk about the means of dispersal because Madison did such a great job discussing it. So we're going to start with the natural means of dispersal first, those being the below ground method and above ground method. Like Madison said, below ground, it spreads through root grafting. This is over very short distances, and there are quite a few control methods to prevent this spread. There are a few things that you have to take into account when considering the likelihood and the size of spread via root grafting. For example, oak wilt was detected in residential and educational locations in Canada. That's not necessarily the case in the United States, where it has been detected in forested areas. What do residential and educational premises have that differ from forested areas? Infrastructure. They have roads and sidewalks. They have underground pipes. All of this can prevent root grafting over longer distances and really limit the spread of the pest. That's to say, while considering how we were going to manage the oak wilt in the residential neighborhoods, we immediately had to take off trenching from the list of viable options because using that device could harm the infrastructure in the residential neighborhoods. Then we have the above ground means of spread, and there's still a lot of research going on which vectors are the most likely to spread the disease, which ones fly at which times, and during what time periods do they have to reach the fresh oak wounds. For example, some research has indicated that a beetle vector that's been rolling around and having a good time in a fungal mat needs to reach a wound that's been wounded within 72 hours to reasonably spread the disease. Like I said, a lot of research is still going on, a lot by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, but this all really influences how much we're educating on preventing pruning during the high risk period. Now, the human assisted means of dispersal. This will tie a little into my next slide and future slides in this presentation, but humans are unfortunately a huge vector of spread for plant pests as well as other things, because we fortunately can go to so many new places that 60, 100 years ago, we weren't going to. We are driving across country, going camping. We could be carrying pests and diseases in our firewood, or they could actually be hitchhiking on our vehicles like some bugs do. For oak wilt, one of the main methods of spread over very long distance is the movement of infected logs and firewood. These will have the fungal mats on them, and it will attract the beetles in the new area, and they'll roll around in the disease and then head off to a freshly wounded oak tree. So while I'm not one who likes to speculate, I prefer facts. It's very likely that humans mediated the spread of oak wilt from the United States 150 kilometers away to Niagara Falls, and then an additional 100 kilometers north to Springwater. So one of my main take-home messages today, I'll say it a few more times, please do not move firewood, buy local and burn local. Another thing that humans can do to limit the spread of oak wilt is restricting your pruning activities or otherwise wounding of oak trees. Now, oaks can be big, beautiful trees, which mean they tend to have large root collars and can sometimes have exposed roots. So just be considerate as you're mowing the lawn in the summer and try your best not to run over where those exposed roots are and accidentally wound your tree. Of course, many of us, especially those who work in provincial parks, are very concerned about human safety. So like Maddie said, if you do have to prune an oak tree because there's a dangerous overhanging branch, just ensure that you use pruning paint or something like that to cover the wound so that it no longer attracts those beetles. Now, that really well led into some of the regulatory tools that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has in place. As for many other pests and diseases, we do have import and domestic movement requirements. That is so that our friends in the United States, as they ship stuff up to us, they don't accidentally send additional stuff, and so that we don't spread additional stuff to the East and West Coast. CFIA has the responsibility and the authority to carry out plant pest surveys and verify all suspect reports. So that's very key for me to mention, as we had one of the questions being, I suspect I have it on my property, what's going to happen? CFIA will come to site. We will take a look, and if we believe it's high enough risk, we will take a sample. So please just keep that in mind. If you submit anything, CFIA will come to site. We can also establish regulatory controls around specific areas to limit the spread of the pest. So for example, the properties in Ontario that have oak wilt, they have a prohibition of movement in place on that location, which means any oak material cannot leave the site without permission by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So in the case of the tree removals, CFIA was on site the entire time. We provided permission to the contractors and the city to remove the trees and safely move them to the disposal site. We oversaw the entire process, and we oversaw the sanitation of all the tools afterwards to limit the spread. And we did a lot of the movement controls by issuing movement certificates that specify where the material is leaving from and where it's going to, and make notes to say that they cannot, stop somewhere else for lunch or something in between getting to the disposal site. Something I want to touch on, as we do get questions about this a lot. What are regulated articles? We have different regulated articles for different pests. In the case of oak wilt, we've said a few times, it can infect any species of oak. So all materials of all oak species are regulated for oak wilt. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't move an oak tree that you bought at a nursery in Windsor up to your house here. But it does mean that if oak wilt is confirmed in Windsor, and let's say the entire city becomes regulated, you're not moving any oak material out of there without permission by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. For example, if you got issued a prohibition of movement, on that piece of paper, it would list what you can't do. So you can't move oak material out of the city of Windsor. If you want to, because we still have to continue regulated activities, foresters still need to do their pruning, people still want to get products from nurseries, you just have to get that permission from Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and we'll come to site, we'll help you figure out the safest way to move those products out of the area. So there are a few key features of the response framework that we implemented when oak wilt was detected in these three areas. The first is our communication strategy, which included not only the CFIA, but many partners. We had a lot of the same messaging that we put out on various platforms, those being social media, as well as newsprint. We did radio interviews, and we sent out email blasts. For example, the Invasive Species Center has a mailing list. We did webinars, that kind of thing, to provide as much information as possible. The main point of a lot of this outreach and education is to empower folks to know what they're looking for, know how to reduce the spread, and know how to report it. Behind the scenes, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency also completed an analysis of the incursion. Now, this is one of the fancy words my group likes to use, but essentially it means we had inspectors go to site and we had them look around for a few factors that could help us determine how we were going to manage this disease. Those factors are listed on the screen. A lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. We want to know how many trees we'll likely have to order to be removed. We want to get a better idea of what the site is like. Is it a residential area, educational, an industrial area, or perhaps is it a forested area where the disease might get away from us? We also want to consider the number of risk generators and begin to take into account how it might have gotten to the site, because then we can work with specific groups to further limit the spread out, as well as determine if this is not the first site, if it might have come here from somewhere else. So for example, if it was a municipal holding yard and there they put all the waste from the trees that they've removed, and one of the trees in the municipal holding yard that was healthy last spring is showing signs of oak wilt, and we knew that that municipality was doing pruning the previous year, we'll ask them where they removed trees or where they prune trees, and we'll start looking at those ones in those areas to determine if perhaps that was the first site of introduction and it led to spread to this new area. Something CFIA also has to consider as the main regulatory body for the country is how any of our decisions will affect industry who still need to carry out their regular activities. So it's a lot to consider, but it leads us to deciding between these two different control strategies, active or passive. The summary of both is that you take active control when it's a small enough infestation and you believe that the natural spread of the disease is easy enough to control. Whereas you take a passive control when it's too widespread, trying to control the natural spread would be too costly and too disruptive to regular activities. And at that point, we try to put control measures in place to limit the human-mediated spread of the disease. We were fortunate. With Oak Wilt in Ontario, the spread, the infestation, and the number of affected people and properties was small enough that we were confident we could take an active control strategy and lead to eradication of this disease. So when you take an active control strategy, you have to implement additional monitoring. This means that we did survey every single tree within 400 meters of the detection. We also worked with our partners who carry out their own survey activities to share any data they had with us about presence and absence. Absence is really important because it means that we don't have to go double check that area and we can focus on different locations. For example, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, they do destructive forestry surveying. So they fly over and they try to map out areas where pest or weather disturbances have caused destruction in the forest. And any pockets they found that looked like some of the images Maddie shared earlier, where you see some dead trees and some dying trees around it, they shared those locations with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And we followed up on every single one. We also followed up on every single report from the public. So like I said, we received over 450 in the 3 summer months that we were actively monitoring for the disease. As Madison mentioned, if you suspect you find oak wilt, please do not cut into the tree. Please do not take off branches. Please do not try to take your own sample, because any of those tools you use, they now have the disease on them, and they have to be cleaned in an appropriate way to prevent the spread. CFIA, we will come to site and we will collect our own samples. Now, because we're using active control, we also have to make sure that the methods we put in place actually work. So for about 5 years after the active control measures, those being the removal of the trees, we'll continue surveillance in the area at a higher intensity than normal to verify that no additional pockets have popped up. We will also continue to do our annual surveys throughout all other high-risk areas in Ontario to verify that oak wilt is not there. So we're gonna briefly go over the control methods as Madison touched on it, and I do recognize I'm already at 30 minutes for this presentation. The first being root disruption, tree removal, and then chemical treatment.
Well, I think we'll be good. The only thing is sometimes we just cross.
Okay.
So it's 3 o'clock.
Okay. Perfect. I only have a few slides left anyways. So root disruption, as Madison mentioned, is to prevent the root grafting. And on the response framework for Canada, we do actually have a table that goes over how to determine how far out you should create that trench line to prevent the risk of spread. It also is helpful for us, CFIA, to determine how far out from the initial infected tree it's likely that root grafting has already taken place, and we'll have to remove those trees. There are some things that you have to consider when determining if root grafting has taken place. For example, the species composition in the forest or neighborhood. It's very likely that same species will graft, whereas different species of oak grafting probably won't occur. You also have to determine the soil type, as some soil types are more efficient for allowing grafts to form and for roots to spread out, and consider the size of the tree as well. A great indicator of the root spread is the spread of the canopy, actually, if you want to just go for a quick estimation. This is challenging in urban areas, though. As I mentioned, there's the urban infrastructure, those being the underground pipes, the underground pools that people have, their decks, what have you. So trenching is really best employed in forest landscapes where we're not concerned about accidentally severing connections to houses that would disrupt normal life. It's also key to note that trenches should be at least 1.2 meters deep, perhaps down to 2. So a lot of things to consider. Tree removal is the action that we took. And one of the questions was, who pays for it? As I mentioned in my answer, with the information that we had, we estimated the number of trees that would require to be removed, and CFAA was confident that we could provide funds to support that. So we worked with the City of Niagara Falls, Niagara-on-the-Lake and Niagara College, and the Township of Springwater, and we provided them a number for how much we would support for tree removal, and they put tenders out for arborists to apply to do that tree removal. Timing of tree removal is important. Those 3 dead standing oaks that had the fungal mats, they were incredibly high risk for furthering the spread of oak wilt. So we cut them down as soon as possible. But those other trees that still had oak leaves that were just showing signs and symptoms, the only way that they could spread was through root grafting, and the spread of root grafting is incredibly slow. So we prioritized surveillance over tree removals at that point. Those trees do have to be removed before spring, because the trees will die over winter and begin forming those fungal mats. And we want to remove the trees before the fungal mats produce. Again, I really want to emphasize, if your tree is infected with oak wilt, it will die. It will become a vector of spread. So we have to remove the trees, unfortunately. There are approved disposal methods, all of which are listed in the response framework, but all of our partners for this past year chose chipping or deep burial. Deep burial was the preferred method for very, very large oak trees where chipping would be far too time consuming and resource intensive. And for the smaller trees like those in Niagara-on-the-Lake, they were 15 feet tall. We chipped on site, and those chips were brought to an approved disposal area. If you're concerned about what option would be taken, please know that we worked with the City of Niagara Falls, all the other townships. We provided them the options, and they chose what worked best for them. CFIA will order an action, so removal, disposal, what have you, but we'll work with you to provide and determine the best option to carry out those activities. Now, finally, we consider chemical treatment a control option because it can slow the spread, but it does not cure oak wilt. There are no cures for oak wilt. Propiconazole is the most studied and most commonly used in the United States, and it has been shown to slow the death of white oaks, but because red oaks can die so quickly, it's shown to have little effect on it. It does require retreatment every 2 years though. So this as well is a resource intensive option. And again, why CFAA at this point is not focusing on it, because we want to take active control and eliminate the disease completely, as opposed to slow its spread. So that's why there are no fungicides approved for use on oak wilt in Canada. Now, like I mentioned, that was really a lot. And I do recognize it's a lot to think about. So my summary is pretty brief. Oak wilt is present in Ontario, and education and outreach like events like today are very key to support the early detection and eradication. It is a very slow moving disease naturally, but we can increase the rate of spread if we're not careful. All species of oak can become infected, and CFIA, as well as partners, are currently taking an active control strategy in the known infected areas. I have 3 key take-home messages. The first being know the signs and symptoms. Right now, trees that got infected this past year would be completely dead or very nearly, and they would need to be removed before the end of this month. Fungal mat production is taking place right now. So if, for example, a tree has not been removed, then you might see those bark cracks that Maddie was talking about earlier. You might smell that fun, juicy fruit smell, that fermented wine smell. It might sound hollow. call the CFIA. If you want to report, there are a few methods that you can do so. My favorite way to tell folks, Google CFIA report a pest. First link that comes up, you have to fill in your personal information. That's just your email address and your name. What matters most is the information that you put in the report. Describe what you're seeing. Take pictures if possible. Myself and a few other experts at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency review every single report we get in. And we don't just review and put yes, no. We get back to you. We ask you additional questions. And if we think it's suspect for Oak Wilt, we come to site. If we don't think it's suspect for Oak Wilt, sometimes we'll provide some suggestion of what it might be. Usually we'll refer you to a registered professional forester who can help you further diagnose the tree if it's yours. Because it was an emergency response, we also made a specific email to take in Oak Wilt reports. If you have questions, believe it or not, this is a little easier to spell than my last name. So you can also submit questions to this email address. I review it. So I believe these presentations will be saved, and I'll also provide my information to Aaron Malarkey, and I'll leave some of these pest cards and pest postcards for you because you can also use those to report. And then finally, know how to prevent. Please do not prune your oak trees unless absolutely necessary between the months of March and October. Do not move firewood or oak logs. And remember that we can reduce the risk of spread if we're careful. So like I said, I know that was a lot of information. I talked for a long time, but if there are any questions now, I can take them. Okay, we'll start nearest to me. Yes, sir. Yes.
They say not to move any oak logs, but lumber does that every day.
Yes. So the lumber industry is very aware of CFIA's processes. So one of the gentlemen here pointed out that I said don't move oak logs, and that the lumber industry does that every day. They're also aware of the domestic movement requirements, and many of them are part of programs that the CFIA oversees to reduce the risk of spread of not only oak wilt, but other pests and diseases. For example, we're trying to limit the spread up north of spongy moth. We also, for a long time, have considered the spread of emerald ash borer. When we say don't move firewood or oak logs, we're saying that to members of the public who might be moving products that they harvested from their own properties in Southern Ontario to a buddy's place or a cottage up in Northern Ontario.
You do any monitoring at the sawmills?
Yes, yep. A lot of them are under programs. So his next question was, do you do any monitoring at the sawmills? Many of them are under programs, not only for oak wilt, but for other pests and diseases. Many of the times when they take in products, they have to come in under a phytosanitary certificate if they're coming from countries other than Canada, or a domestic movement certificate if they're coming from provinces other than Ontario. Mills are also one of the high-risk locations that we survey at annually. A woman in the back row had a question, so I'll come to you in a moment.
I'm thinking we probably shouldn't assume that our local arborist is already educated about this.
So CFIA, Invasive Species Center, many municipalities are doing their best to hope that the local arborist is aware of it. We did 2 Oak Wilt information sessions and a Q&A opportunity, and we've tried to connect with the overarching Arborist Association for Ontario, but yes, we can't necessarily reach everyone.
So we should, if we're speaking to our arborist, bring up this subject?
Yes, you can. If an arborist has been contracted to do an oak tree removal, take into consideration that it might have died from oak wilt. So maybe take a look at the tree beforehand. A lot of the reports that we received were from arborists this year. So like I said, we're trying our best, but to operate under an abundance of caution, you can assume that perhaps they might not know.
Sorry, actually,
On that.
sorry. Someone had just said our municipality prunes, the boulevards, and I'm assuming it's similar.
Yes.
Answer to that. It's just continuing with that awareness, you're trying your best.
Yes.
We hope that like people working in those roles who care about the trees and
Yeah.
are aware.
And I will note, every municipality, as many arborists as possible, the conservation authorities in Niagara region, as well as Barrie Springwater, that entire section, the county of Simcoe, we provided all that information to them. So the highest risk areas nearest to the known detections in Ontario have been well educated. We work with their social media accounts. We even worked with their disposal sites so that if they see any incoming oak products, they stop, they take a look. They actually shared some of the outreach products that we developed with whoever was bringing it in so that we further that education, that ripple effect. We're going to go to the very back, and then I believe you're next, sir. So.
Are there temperature guidelines for the pruning periods? Like, it's so warm right now.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started on winter, but the question is, are there temperature periods? Not enough research has been done at this point. That's why we continue to operate under the abundance of caution that you can prune between November and March, and outside of that, please try to limit activities. As Maddie said, we do have researchers doing a lot of work on the sap beetles and the oak bark beetles to determine when they're flying. And typically, you know, these beetles don't immediately adapt to a warmer winter like this. It might take a few winters. So we could see how things evolve over time. Right now, you know, CFAA just finished, we actually just finished removing all the trees. So officially all Oak Wilt trees have been removed. But, you know, we can still safely operate under the assumption that transmission of Oak Wilt is still lowest risk between November and March. Okay, sir.
I've got two.
Yep.
The first one maybe is just an observation. Just up yonder on the highway, we've got a chap that sells firewood. And places flat to the ground all winter. Then all of a sudden it's full firewood. So I assume he has that shipped in. Would that be regulated at some point?
Theoretically, yes. Hopefully, yes. There are a lot of factors that could impact whether or not it's regulated, where he's getting the products from, who he's getting it from. Many mills or foresters, like I said, are aware of the regulations, but if it's, you know, Joe Blow down the street with his buddy who's got a wood lot, it might not translate. He might not know. I know, it gives me a headache too. Okay.
What you just said was prompted me to think of it.
Okay. Do you want me to come back to you in a moment? Okay. So gentleman in the black shirt behind man with the glasses. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, in the GTA, there's a community named Oak Wilt.
Oh, I know Oakville.
They saved a 200- or 300-year-old oak tree that's in, and they built a road around it. Is there any way, could you treat that with a fungicide, and will that provide some sort of help for the tree to perhaps survive, you know, as things spread?
That's a great question. So I've forgotten to address my friends online. A gentleman asked specifically to a beautiful 200-300-year-old oak in Oakville, could we proactively treat it to help slow the spread? In theory, yes, propiconazole is available, but not in Canada. So at this point, there is nothing to administer that could proactively protect. But again, if it's a red oak, off the top of my head, I don't know. It really won't have much impact on it if we did have the fungicide propiconazole registered in Canada. I really want to emphasize that oak wilt seems scary, but we caught it early. And we're still very hopeful that we won't get to a point where we have to worry about that tree. So, you know, events like this, getting all the information that you can and keeping your eyes peeled, this is what's important. I will take any email and respond to all those to help support that. Gentleman, second row, and then I'll get to you.
What is your confidence level that we can contain this disease and prevent the spread of him?
Like I mentioned, I am not one to speculate. So gentleman here asked what my confidence level is that we can contain the spread in Canada. So I'm not one to speculate. I work on the current facts that we have and the stats that we have and the groups that we collaborate with. Based on the spread of surveys that we were able to complete formally, as well as reports from the public that we received, and a lot of the surveys from our friends in other agencies, at this point, I'm confident. But it came from Ontario County, New York to Niagara Falls. Anything can happen with life. So right now, I feel confident. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency feels confident. That's why we're taking the active management approach. But we don't know what's going to happen in this next survey season. There could be your average forester down the street who's doing what he wants. You know, you never really know. So hope that helps. Sorry, we do have a woman in the back. I did not see your hand up earlier.
I just had a question of the antifungal. So it's not approved for use in Canada. In the States, would someone prescribe that antifungal? Would it be a biologist or arborist? And does the dose vary based on like how big the oak tree is? Or is it a controlled substance, or can homeowners purchase it on their own?
I'm actually not sure. So the question was, in the States, using the fungicide, essentially how is it regulated and administered? I'm not sure because it's not currently for use in Canada. I haven't looked into it that much. I'm not the individual who looks into fungicides. With my experience from other chemical treatments that we've used for other pests and diseases, if it were to come to Canada, it would have to be administered by a registered pesticide applicator, and it would depend on the size of the tree. It would depend on several other factors as well, and it would be closely regulated. Okay. I'll come back to you, and then I see we've got gentlemen there and gentlemen there.
Can arborists get a certification in dealing with Oak Wilt? Because municipalities will hire, they'll have a list of contractors. So how would a municipality be able to judge that they're hiring somebody that is differentiated from a guy with a chainsaw versus somebody that builds out their animals?
Yeah. So the question is, can arborists essentially become certified to handle an oak wilt situation? If you are being contracted to remove trees that have tested positive for oak wilt, CFIA will be there the entire time to verify that every single thing that you do will prevent the risk of additional spread. We'll also verify that you're following all the protocols and disposing of the proper methods. Now, if you're not dealing with oak wilt, we can't necessarily regulate exactly what you're doing because you're not working with regulated articles or in a regulated area. All that being said, the Invasive Species Center, I believe, does have a course where arborists can get a certain certification in oak wilt. So
our training course that I mentioned, you can get ISA credits if you're ISA certified with them. We did do a workshop a few years back in collaboration with the National Society of Agriculture. And in that course, arborists completed it to get oak wilt certified. We haven't done that exact certification again recently, but I guess I'm hoping to do maybe next year or so.
I'm just going to jump to let some of the virtual attendees ask some questions, just because I am worried that the Zoom link will stop right at 3. And then we can jump back to the in-person in case that does happen.
Okay.
So I just put them up there.
All right. Will cutting and logging of oaks be encouraged to occur only in winter, the low risk period? Migratory nesting birds would like that too. So as much as possible, yes, we are encouraging limiting the cutting and pruning of oaks to only occur in winter. However, under normal Canadian winter conditions, we recognize that's also a safety concern. So at this point, CFIA is not putting in any regulations to 100% prevent any cutting or pruning activities, because again, we only have those 3 properties that are regulated for the pest. Now, it is strongly encouraged, and as much as possible, we do put that information in posts on the internet, in some of our outreach materials. Every time I get a media call, I try to talk about it as well. But to answer the question, it's not prohibited from cutting or pruning oaks during the highest risk period. It's strongly encouraged that you do not, if you do not want to contribute to the spread of the disease. Okay, so this next question. I'm concerned if enough is being done to fight hemlock woolly adelgid. Do you have any encouraging news on hemlock woolly adelgid? I have news on hemlock woolly adelgid. For those of you who do not know, hemlock woolly adelgid is another invasive pest. It's a very tiny insect, and it has been detected in Ontario, mostly throughout the Niagara region, as well as a city on the north shore of Lake Ontario. CFIA, as well as many partners, again, including the Invasive Species Center, is working very hard to limit the human-mediated spread of this disease, this pest. This pest spreads very easily. It's super tiny. It can attach to mammals or birds as they move about, but humans, again, can limit the spread of this pest. So to answer the question, CFIA is also working very closely on hemlock woolly adelgid, ensuring that we do surveys throughout the province at high-risk areas and working with partners who are trying to manage it. Okay, I'm not looking at the screen anymore. Yes, sir.
So thanks to both of you, great information. I have sort of a multi-part point.
Oh, challenging.
It seems like in the US, it's beyond control now. So we applied passive regulations at the US-Canada border to deal with products coming into Canada.
Yes, that's a great question. So he asks, with the idea that it has spread quite extensively in the United States and it is definitely not being eradicated, has Canada employed any measures to prevent at the border the movement of this material? Yes. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is a regulatory body for the country. We have import requirements and domestic movement requirements. So any material coming from the United States, like logs or lumber, will need a phytosanitary certificate. To get a phytosanitary certificate, the exporter has to work with the USDA and their plant health inspection services to have a full inspection of the material. In the case of oaks, it has to be treated to prevent the spread. And at the border, our friends at Canadian Border Services, they will stop trucks. They will ask for phytosanitary certificates. And sometimes even with phytosanitary certificates, they'll do an inspection of the product. As well, CFIA works with CBSA and does blitzes at the border. So our inspectors will go there as well and increase whatever we're inspecting to, again, further decrease the risk of spread. And finally, many of our importing facilities are also under programs that the CFIA oversees, and we will go check on the products when it's been brought in. We'll verify the phytosanitary certificates. We will audit them to verify that they have all the proper documentation that proves that the product that they're bringing in has been inspected and has been treated and theoretically is not at risk of bringing oak wilt into the country. And I will note for a lot of our other regulated plant pests, similar programs and processes take place.
So my other question would be, have they figured out in the US where the oak wilt has devastated an area, will oak trees ever grow again in those areas? Is it possible to know that yet? Or like, does the fungus die eventually and then oaks could start to grow again?
That's a great question. So his follow-up is, in the US, where oak wilt has devastated the area, more or less, does the disease ever die and leave the area? And so far, the research has proved that the disease can remain in the root system of a tree for, I think, 3 to 4 years. I am unaware if the United States is taking any reforestation projects for oaks in these areas, because truthfully, it depends on if they remove all the trees. It depends on if all the trees got infected with oak wilt right away, the forest composition. Is it red oaks that died within a season, or is it white oaks that have been surviving for a couple years? So there are a few factors to consider, but ultimately, to answer your question, research has shown that the disease can persist in a root system for 3 to 4 years. In the back.
Decent, or maybe this is more in the US, but do you know if they've identified any trees with like resistance or like specific areas where there's any resistance to it naturally, or since it's been so long?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So they're wondering if there are any trees that have shown any resistance to the disease. And as far as we know from the research, red oaks, you're kaput, you're gonna die, no luck. White oaks have shown resistance. Bur oaks, live oaks, all the others, they'll likely also die, but some white oaks have shown resistance. They will eventually die, and their roots are still a vector for spread. So even if there's resistance, if the disease is within the root system and it's close enough to other oaks, it's still a risk. And in the case of Canada, we will still remove the tree at this point with the research we have while we're taking the active approach.
On that, is it at a point where you would maybe encourage if somebody was looking to plant a white oak over a red oak?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So Aaron asked if I were providing advice, would I recommend a white oak over a red oak? And I've been asked this question several times. I think it was actually asked in the Q&A webinar that we did initially when oak wilt was detected. We are not providing any guidance on planting of trees outside of where oak wilt is known to occur. We know that foresters and local arborists and municipalities have quite intensely researched planting lists. And at this point, because oak wilt has not been discovered in their area, we want them to continue as normal. Now, if they decide that they do want to slow the chance of spread, then yes, oak wilt would be slower to spread in white oaks than in red oaks. But overall, we're not providing any guidance. Please don't plant any invasive plant species, but if you're trying to decide between oak trees, go with whatever the municipality or, whatever you prefer. Okay. Yeah, do we have any more questions? Oh, almost sorry I've asked. Okay, you go ahead.
What about this beetle? How about attacking it like as a root cause of the problem? Well, it's not the root cause, but it's a spread. Right?
Yeah.
Like the gypsy moth, I think they were spraying with something that sterilized the moth and not allowed to have offspring.
Yeah.
Could something like that be considered, or is it being considered?
So it's not being considered. So the question is, what about the beetles? Are we doing anything to control them, to decrease the population, or do anything to prevent the beetle from spreading it? These beetles are all native, so they're all needed in the ecosystem. So we're not doing anything to stop them. As well, they're not actually actively attacking trees. Most of them are fungivores. Most of them have secondary hosts of rotting fruit. They're also typically seen in cornfields and that kind of thing. And a lot of them are very necessary to the ecosystem. Most of them, they aren't even borers. So they're not like emerald ash borer that are biting in and chewing throughout the tree. They like wounds. They'll come there, they'll eat the sap or the fungus, for example. So as far as research for the beetles go, we're looking at the ones that are, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. They're looking at the beetles that most commonly are found on oak wilt fungal mats, and then most commonly found on oak wilt wounds, and what times of year this happens.
Someone online just has a question about controlled burns.
We're not looking into controlled burns at this time. So it looks like, will forest fire make any difference or have any effect? Fire does kill the disease, but it's not something that CFIA is suggesting. As well, we're only removing the trees that are positive or are likely to be positive through root grafting. So we're not looking at controlled burns. However, if it's part of your forest management guide, have at her. Fire kills the disease anyways.
If we have like a limb or a tree go down on its own and have to cut it up in pieces to remove it, is it just the stump or like the still standing part of the tree that has to be painted, or
It's the still standing part.
So anything that's not attached to the tree or those cuts don't have to be.
Correct. So the question is, let's say through a lightning storm or whatever, a limb from a healthy oak tree comes off naturally and you want to cut up that limb for your own fire or to take it to the local dump or something like that. You only need to worry about pruning paint or covering the open wound on the still standing tree. Oak wilt does not spread from open wounds on infected trees. It's only from fungal mats. So it's only when the tree is completely dead. And when we say don't prune your oak trees or cover wounds on oak trees, it's to prevent the beetle that already has the spores, already has the fungus on it, from going to that new wound. So we're only trying to protect the still standing trees.
So they would go, I guess, like, if you had a trellis log that was freshly cut,
Mhm.
the beetles, is there a concern about them going in to that cut piece and letting something develop there and then it going somewhere else? Like, you don't worry about that?
That's a great question as well. So she's asking if we're concerned about a freshly cut log. Are we concerned about the beetle coming into that and something living in there? Oak wilt needs a living tree to develop. So if it's a dead log and it's not pumping water and nutrients up there, the disease isn't going to spread through it. Oak wilt will not infect something that's dead and down.
Last part of that, is there a difference between like regular spray paint and pruning paint?
Yes. Is there a difference between regular spray paint and pruning paint? Pruning paint is sort of like a latex spray, so it's a little bit thicker. The main thing that we are trying to hammer home is that the beetles are attracted to the scent of wounds. So regular spray paint can take the smell away, but creating that actual covering over it can also further reduce the risk. In the case of Niagara Falls, we actually covered it with saran wrap as well, because things aren't going to burrow through saran wrap, Yes, sir.
How about masking scent with some other natural products?
Theoretically, you could mask the scent with some other natural products. That's what his question is. In the case of an oak wilt infected tree or trees that are nearby to infected areas, we do highly recommend you choose a pruning paint or a latex spray and or the saran wrap out of an abundance of caution. Yeah.
Just curiosity, if I happen to find a tree that I think is infected, I would call you guys. An average person would call you guys and develop this information, permits and such like.
So if we're still on Zoom, the question is, if an average person, average homeowner finds oak wilt, can they afford to report it? At this point, yes. Especially if it's a single tree that you're concerned about. If it does end up being positive, and if we're continuing to follow the approach that we were taking before, CFIA will support the removal of it. Once a tree has been removed from the property, the prohibition of movement is actually released, because at that point, that property no longer has oak wilt on it. So you would not have to worry about any permits to move that material. If we're considering the permits for the removal and movement of material to a dump, that was incurred by the arborists, and the arborists then charged the city for it, and the city then charged CFIA for it. So at this point, I'm going to use a phrase I used earlier. We are empowering members of the public to feel confident in reporting, because CFIA, as well as partners, are taking the active approach, and we want to support everything that we can for the eradication of the disease.
Well, the reason I'm asking that question is because I probably have 50 oak trees on my property.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought, well, you'd say if one's infected, they're all infected.
Not necessarily.
It's a small area.
Yeah, so it depends on the size of the oak tree. It depends on the soil composition. It depends on how close the trees are to each other. And for example, if it's one and your infected tree is right here, but you have trees, and let's assume the infected tree is this big and this is 10 meters or something like that. You have oak trees all along here. We're not going to cut down this tree. If it's just this single tree, it's very likely that only these ones are also at risk.
So these trees that you've been showing us are all native trees. Are you saying the infection can be in a 1-inch round tree?
Any size and or species of oak tree can become infected with the disease. The size of the tree will impact how fast it dies. For example, oak wilt is not likely to spread through the nursery trade because those trees are so small, they'd likely die before they made it to the sales floor.
No, but I have a lot of.
Little saplings?
Yes.
Yep, we will inspect those if we come to site. They are at risk of getting the disease and of passing it on through root grafting. They are very unlikely to develop the fungal mat. The research has shown that the radius needs to be at least, off the top of my head, I don't remember. I think it's 3 inches for a fungal mat to form.
Thank you for your tolerance.
No worries. You wouldn't believe some of the questions.
Well,
I've
maybe
gotten.
just take this last question. I don't know if you can, it's a bit of a bit more of a global question.
Okay. Should forest management practices such as burning that reduce species diversity be reconsidered in view of oak wilt and climate warming threats? If you're wondering, sir, this question's harder than the one that you had asked me. I think, and I'm saying this not as a member of CFIA, but more as a biologist who loves the forests. We're reaching a time where, yes, forest management practices should be thought about because climate change is increasing the natural range of many pests that have been in the United States for years. That could be a problem in Canada. It's also changing how long pests can be on the landscape. It is also affecting freeze-thaw cycles that could harm the infrastructure of trees. That's not to say that forest management practices should change. At heart, I am an entomologist, not a forester, so I'm not going to provide any guidance on that. But I think many human activities need to consider what is happening in the world today and what we are going to do about it. So it was vague of an answer, but I think we always need to consider how our activities can impact climate change and how climate change impacts our activities. Again, I didn't say that as a CFIA person.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Now let's give a I'll just quickly, because this is both, we have some kind of general members of the community here. So just so people are aware, we are the Friends of the Pinery Park who put this presentation on today, not Pinery Provincial Park. So we're a nonprofit group that helps to support Pinery Provincial Park. So if you're interested in attending more of these discussions, you are welcome to become a member. If you just head to our website, you can join to be a member there. It's $25 a year. You have some access to some other talks throughout the year. So if you just love learning about kind of what's going on here in our local ecosystems, it's a great group to be a part of. So I just want to thank everybody for coming today. If you feel inclined, we do have a small donation tip tap, one that you just tap your card at just outside the door. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming today. I think this has been on the minds of a lot of people in the community. And I personally feel much more assured or reassured that this is going to be possibly okay. I was thinking it was this big looming threat that was about to devastate our beautiful oak savannas, but it's definitely more positive. So even though it's a doom and gloom talk, I'm walking away feeling more positive. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that. Oh no. Oh, sorry.
I don't know if you have time for questions or not. I wrote down the wrong time for this
Oh,
meeting.
yeah.
I arrived almost
Yeah.
at the end.
I'm sending out a recording.
Okay.
Yes.
And where do I get the recording?
Did you sign up? Did you purchase, like, go online to get a ticket for this?
No.
Okay, so then I'm gonna get your email address and I will make sure to add it to it.
Thank you.
Can I just get you to write your email address in for me?
Yes.
Is that something you're okay doing? And I'll add you to the list, okay? Hi.
Hi, I just wanted, you're Erin.
I'm Erin.
My name's Renee.
Hi,
and
Renee.
I just wanted to thank you for supporting Canadian Coalition of Invasive.
Yes,
CCIPR.
yes. Oh, fabulous. Great. Yeah, we are
that
very
was so
happy to support
great.
it. We just had to double check with the park that it was an okay thing. If things can kind of get political. Yeah.
Well, that's
but
what I was worried about.
yeah,
so that's
it's definitely
awesome.
something we are passionate about. So yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
That's all. And
Yeah.
if you know of any other groups that you think
Yeah.
we should try to get, I could send them letters.
Yeah, let me,
If you think of them.
I
think,
will reach out.
Amanda has my
Amanda
email
has your
already.
email. We'll definitely reach out because we want to get this known.
Yeah. So that was great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for
and it was
coming.
So excellent.
Oh, good. Yeah, they were both fantastic.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Really good.
That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I will add you to the list, okay?
I didn't touch anything else.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, so I will send that out within the next couple of days, so you should get the,
Okay.
be able to get the whole presentation.
And that's on the Zoom, is it?
It's on the Zoom, so I can, I thought I messed it up, but I'm gonna save the recording.
Right.
So it should save all the slides and the speaker, so you should have everything available. Yeah, okay?
And I remember on Zoom, so that should make it
Yes,
easy.
yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Yeah.
You've got other. Morning, Richard.
I'm just wondering if you've met on Zoom before.
Oh, I don't
I
know.
didn't catch your name. at the
Oh,
beginning.
I'm Erin Mielewczyk.
Okay.
Yes,
I don't
yes.
think we have been on
No,
Zoom.
no.
Have the car on Zoom?
In that car?
Yeah.
I'm new.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
Used
glad.
to be on the communications team. Oh, okay. Yes, I joined like a year. I'm a year in, and I just kind of really jumped into it all.
Well, good,
Yes.
good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah. So we have some exciting things coming up. We are hoping, I think, to offer a little bit more back to members. Yeah, we've got some exciting stuff coming up.
Yeah, we're hoping to improve the membership
Yeah,
experience too.
it's a big priority for us
Yeah.
moving forward, and we're going to talk about the AGM and
It seems like it's been kind of stagnant numbers of members for a long time.
yeah, yeah. So we're
Yeah, we
hoping,
want a strategic plan and just
maybe tap into some, get some younger folks coming to it around and getting involved is kind of our goal. And yeah.
We need more people.
Yeah.
Fewer people. No.
Oh, no, it's all
not
important.
fewer,
It's
no.
all important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm not planning to start on being.
Yeah. Well, nice to meet you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you
it was
so
good
much
to
for
see you,
coming.
Richard.
Yeah.
I'll reach out with the Dropbox folder for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I wanted to see if this is. Okay, I just want to make sure I save this recording.
I know when I closed it last time.
It did. Okay, so if I go stop recording.